First story. The night the sky swallowed me. Brazil, 2009. It was just another night on the road, or so I thought. As a truck driver, I'm used to long hauls and lonely stretches of highway, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on BR 101 that night in 2009. The darkness was thick, like a heavy blanket draped over the world, with no moon to offer even a sliver of light. I'd been driving for hours, the steady hum of my truck's engine and the occasional flicker of passing headlights my only companions. The clock on my dashboard read just past midnight when things started to get weird. At first it was just a feeling, that prickle on the back of your neck like someone's watching you. I tried to shake it off, cranking up the radio and singing along to some old rock tunes, but the feeling wouldn't budge. It was like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I remember checking my mirrors more often than usual, peering into the darkness behind me, half expecting to see something. But the road was empty, stretching out behind me like a black ribbon disappearing into nothingness. That's when I first noticed the light. It started as just a pinprick in the distance, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. But as I kept driving, it grew brighter and closer. My first thought was that it must be another vehicle, maybe some hotshot in a sports car coming up fast behind me. But something about it didn't sit right. The light was too steady, too perfect. It didn't bob or weave like headlights should on the uneven road. And it was silent. Dead silent. In all my years of driving, I've never seen headlights that didn't come with the sound of an engine, even faintly. But this was like a ghost creeping up on me. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white as I watched that light in my rearview mirror. It kept getting closer and brighter, and I swear it felt like it was boring into the back of my skull. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just some weird atmospheric thing, or maybe I was more tired than I realized. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. As the light got closer, things started to get really freaky. My truck, which had been running smooth as silk all night, suddenly started to hiccup and sputter. The engine coughed and wheezed like it was gasping for air. The headlights began to flicker, casting crazy shadows on the road ahead. It was like all the electricity in the vehicle was being sucked out. I've never felt so vulnerable, so exposed. Here I was, in this big rig that usually made me feel invincible, and suddenly it was about as useful as a tin can on wheels. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, warning lights flashing in a panic. I could feel the truck losing power, slowing down even though my foot was still pressed hard on the gas pedal. It was like something was draining the life right out of my vehicle. And all the while, that light kept getting closer and brighter. It was so intense now that I could barely see the road ahead. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst right out of my chest. In that moment, I knew I had to stop. Not because I wanted to. God knows I wanted nothing more than to keep driving and get the hell away from whatever this was. But my truck was dying, and I was afraid if I didn't stop voluntarily, I'd end up stalled in the middle of the highway anyway. With hands shaking so bad I could barely control them, I guided the truck to the side of the road and cut the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. The moment I stopped the truck, everything changed. That light, which had been chasing me down the highway, suddenly enveloped my entire cab. It was blindingly bright, seeping in through every crack and crevice, making it impossible to see anything outside. I remember trying to shield my eyes, but it was useless. The light seemed to penetrate right through my eyelids, burning itself into my retinas. And then came the pressure. It started in my chest, like someone was sitting on me, pressing down with all their weight. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My whole body felt heavy, pinned to the seat by some invisible force. I tried to reach for the door handle, thinking, maybe if I could just get out of the truck, I'd be okay. But my arms wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my own body. The panic that washed over me in that moment was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I've been in some tight spots in my life, but this was something else entirely. It felt like I was being observed, studied even, by something I couldn't see or understand. The air in the cab grew thick and heavy, charged with a kind of electricity that made my skin tingle and my hair stand on end. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each second feeling like an eternity. As I sat there, helpless and terrified, the strangest sensation came over me. It was like I was floating, my body becoming lighter than air despite the pressure holding me down. The boundaries between me and my surroundings began to blur. I could no longer tell where I ended and the truck began. It was as if I was being pulled apart at the molecular level, my consciousness expanding beyond the confines of my physical form. Images started flashing through my mind, too fast for me to grasp. Glimpses of places I'd never seen, creatures I couldn't begin to describe. It was overwhelming, like my brain was being flooded with information it wasn't equipped to handle. I tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound came out. My throat felt constricted, my voice stolen away by whatever force had me in its grip. The entire world had narrowed down to this single point of experience, this moment of absolute terror and wonder. I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming, alive or dead. Everything I thought I knew about reality was being questioned, torn apart, and reassembled in ways I couldn't comprehend. And through it all, that light continued to pulse and throb, seeming to respond to my thoughts and fears. I don't know how long I was in that state. It could have been minutes, hours, or days for all I knew. Time had lost all meaning. But suddenly, as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished. The pressure on my chest eased, and I could move again. I gasped for air, my lungs burning as if I'd been holding my breath for far too long. My vision slowly cleared, the after-images of that intense light fading to reveal the familiar interior of my truck cab. Everything looked normal, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could feel it in my bones, in the way my skin crawled and my head throbbed. Something profound had occurred, something that had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. With shaking hands, I reached for the ignition, half expecting the truck not to start, but it roared to life as if nothing had happened, all systems normal. It was then that I glanced at the clock on my dashboard and felt my blood run cold. According to the readout, more than 2 hours had passed since I'd pulled over. 2 hours that I couldn't account for. 2 hours lost to that strange, terrifying experience. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of the lost time and the lingering sensations coursing through my body. Part of me wanted to just drive away, to put as much distance between myself and this stretch of highway as possible. But another part, a part I didn't fully recognize, felt drawn to the spot, as if some piece of me had been left behind in that otherworldly encounter. Reluctantly, I forced myself to step out of the truck. My legs felt wobbly, like I was walking on a ship in rough seas. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, grounding me in reality. Or at least what I hoped was reality. I stumbled around the truck, inspecting it for any signs of what had happened. No scorch marks, no weird residue, nothing out of the ordinary. It was frustratingly normal. But as I circled back to the driver's side, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the gravel on the shoulder of the road, was a perfect circle of flattened grass and earth, about 20 feet in diameter. The vegetation inside the circle looked scorched, like it had been exposed to intense heat. I knelt down to touch it, half expecting my hand to burn. But it was cool to the touch. The circle was centered exactly where the light had been brightest. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized this was tangible proof that I hadn't imagined. The whole thing. Something had been here, something that defied explanation. I quickly snapped a few pictures with my old flip phone, hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure they'd come out clear. I needed evidence, something to look at later when doubt inevitably crept in. As I stood there staring at that impossible circle, a wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't just the physical after effects of whatever had happened. It was the realization that my world had irreversibly changed. Everything I thought I knew about reality, about what was possible, had been thrown into question. I'd always been a practical guy, someone who dealt in the tangible world of trucks and highways and delivery schedules. But now I felt like I'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of our reality. And what I'd seen there was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been chosen for this experience, that it wasn't just some random encounter. But why me? What made me special? Or was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time? These questions swirled in my mind, making me dizzy. I leaned against the truck, trying to steady myself, when I noticed something else. My watch had stopped. Not just stopped, but the hands were spinning wildly, as if time itself had gone haywire. It was a cheap digital thing, nothing fancy, but I'd had it for years, and it had never failed me before. Now it seemed as broken as my sense of normalcy. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between the desire to flee and the morbid curiosity to investigate further, but eventually the sound of an approaching vehicle snapped me out of my daze. Headlights appeared in the distance, and for a moment I tensed, fearing a repeat of what had just happened. But it was just another truck, lumbering down the highway. The sight of it, so mundane and familiar, almost brought tears to my eyes. It was a reminder that the world was still turning, that life was going on as normal for everyone else. As the truck passed by, the driver gave me a casual wave, probably thinking I'd just stopped for a break. If only he knew. That simple interaction was enough to jolt me back to reality. I knew I couldn't stay here forever. Whatever had happened, whatever. That light it was gone now. And I had a job to do, deliveries to make. With one last look at the mysterious circle, I climbed back into my truck. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but I forced myself to take a deep breath and start the engine. The familiar rumble was comforting, a lifeline to the world I knew. As I pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't help glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that light reappear. But there was nothing but darkness behind me. The encounter was over, but I knew my journey to understand it was just beginning. The rest of that night's drive was a blur. I pushed on, desperate to complete my route and get home, but my mind was nowhere near the road. Every flicker of light in my mirrors made me flinch. Every unexpected sound had me on edge. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to make sense of it all. The light, the pressure, the floating sensation. It all seemed so surreal now, like a vivid nightmare. But then I'd glance at my still malfunctioning watch or think about that perfect circle on the roadside, and the reality of it all would come crashing back. I must have checked my phone 100 times, looking at those blurry photos I'd taken. They weren't great, just dark smudges that could have been anything, but they were proof. Proof that something had happened, even if I couldn't explain what. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Part of me had been afraid the sun would never rise again, that I'd somehow been trapped in an eternal night. But as the familiar colors of daybreak painted the horizon, I also felt like I was leaving something behind. Like that otherworldly encounter belonged to the realm of darkness, and the coming day was stealing it away from me. When I finally finished my route and made it home, I was a mess. Exhausted, shaken, and probably looking like I'd seen a ghost, which for all I knew, maybe I had. I stumbled into my small apartment, barely remembering to lock the door behind me. I should have been starving, should have wanted a shower and sleep, but all I could think about was getting to my computer. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced something similar. With shaking hands, I typed in search terms: UFO sightings, alien abductions, lost time experiences. What I found both terrified and fascinated me. There were thousands of stories out there, some so similar to mine it made my hair stand on end. People who had seen strange lights, felt unexplained pressures, lost time they couldn't account for. I read account after account, my eyes burning from staring at the screen for hours. Some of the stories seemed far-fetched, easy to dismiss. But others rang with the truth I couldn't deny. I recognized the fear in their words, the struggle to comprehend what had happened to them. It was the same fear and confusion that was eating away at me. As I delved deeper into these accounts, I started noticing patterns. Many of the encounters happened on lonely stretches of road, just like mine. Many involved some kind of vehicle malfunction, and almost all of them spoke of that feeling of being observed, studied. It was like putting together pieces of a massive, mysterious puzzle. But the more pieces I found, the more I realized how little I actually understood. Every answer only led to more questions. Why were these beings, if they were beings, so interested in us? What were they looking for? And why did they always seem to release their subjects back into the world, confused and changed, but essentially unharmed? I thought about the images that had flashed through my mind during the encounter, the glimpses of places and creatures. I couldn't comprehend. Had those been real? Were they memories or visions or something else entirely? The more I thought about it, the more my head hurt. It was like trying to remember a dream that was quickly fading away. But unlike a dream, the physical evidence remained. My watch was still malfunctioning. The photos on my phone still showed that strange circle. This was real, whether I wanted it to be or not. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to return to my normal life. Every time I got behind the wheel of my truck, my heart would race, my palms would sweat. The open road, which had once been my sanctuary, now felt like a hunting ground. I'd find myself scanning the skies obsessively, both dreading and hoping for another encounter. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that moment, engulfed in that otherworldly light. I started taking different routes, avoiding BR 101 like the plague, even if it meant longer trips and less pay. My co-workers noticed the change in me. I could see the concern in their eyes, hear the whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. "Marcos isn't the same," they'd say. "Something happened to him out there." But how could I explain? How could I tell them that everything I thought I knew about the world had been turned upside down in a single night? I tried once with a buddy I'd known for years. The look of disbelief and pity on his face as I recounted my experience was enough to make me clam up. From then on, I kept it to myself, letting them think I was just going through a rough patch or maybe hitting the bottle too hard. It was easier than facing their skepticism, or worse, their belief. Because if they believed me, if they accepted what had happened, then it would make it all too real. As time passed, the acute terror of that night began to fade, replaced by a gnawing, persistent anxiety. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending every free moment researching UFO phenomena and extraterrestrial encounters. I joined online forums, corresponded with self-proclaimed abductees and ufologists. Some were clearly charlatans or delusional, but others had a ring of truth that resonated with my own experience. I found myself drawn to scientific articles about quantum physics and the nature of reality, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we truly understand about the universe. The idea that we might not be alone in the cosmos was both thrilling and terrifying, but it wasn't just the possibility of alien life that haunted me. It was the implications of their technology, their abilities. If they could manipulate time and space, if they could immobilize a grown man in a several-ton truck with nothing but light, what else were they capable of? And what did they want with us? These questions consumed me, driving a wedge between me and the rest of the world. I felt like I was living on a different plane of existence, aware of truths that others couldn't or wouldn't see. It was lonely, isolating, but I couldn't let it go. The encounter had awakened something in me, a need to understand, to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Now, years later, I still find myself grappling with what happened that night on BR 101. The intensity of the experience has faded somewhat, but its impact on my life is undeniable. I've never had another encounter like that one, despite countless nights on the road, countless hours staring at the sky. Sometimes I wonder if it was a one-time thing, a cosmic fluke that I was lucky, or unlucky, enough to experience. Other times, I'm convinced it was just the beginning, that they're out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to find a balance between seeking answers and living my life. But I'll never forget that night, never stop wondering about what's out there in the vastness of space. To those who've never experienced something like this, it might sound crazy. Hell, sometimes I think I am crazy. But then I look at those old photos on my phone, or I remember the feeling of that scorched earth beneath my fingers. And I know that something profound and inexplicable happened to me that night. And I know that our universe is far stranger and more wondrous than most of us dare to imagine. So I keep driving, keep watching the skies, and keep hoping that someday, somehow, I'll find the answers I'm looking for. Because once you've seen behind the veil of reality, there's no going back. You can only move forward into the unknown. Second story, the abduction at Nuevo León, Mexico, 2010. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It's been eating away at me for years, and I need to get it off my chest. I'm a truck driver, have been for most of my life. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in Nuevo León. It was supposed to be a routine haul, just another long night on the endless highways of northern Mexico. The roads were empty, stretching out before me like a black ribbon under the star-filled sky. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, just me and the rumble of my engine. But that peace was about to be shattered in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony only broken by the occasional gas station or small town. The radio was playing softly, some local station fading in and out as I moved through the mountains. I wasn't tired, though. I was used to these long hauls, and I had a thermos of strong coffee to keep me company. But as I rounded a bend, something caught my eye that made me forget all about my coffee and my cargo. At first, I thought it was just a shooting star, a brief flash of light in the corner of my vision. But then I saw it again, and this time it was unmistakable. There was a light in the sky, moving in ways that no plane or helicopter ever could. It zipped across the horizon, then stopped dead in its tracks before shooting straight up into the air. My heart started racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in UFOs or any of that nonsense, but what I was seeing, it wasn't natural. I slowed the truck down, my eyes glued to this impossible light show in the sky. That's when things got really freaky. The light suddenly changed direction, and I realized with a jolt of fear that it was heading straight for me. I hit the brakes hard, the truck screeching to a halt on the deserted road. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the door handle, somehow knowing I needed to get out and see this thing up close. As soon as I stepped out of the cab, I was hit by a wave of something. It wasn't a sound exactly, but I could feel it in my bones, a deep vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air felt charged, like right before a thunderstorm, but 100 times more intense. And that light, God, that light was getting closer and brighter by the second. I wanted to run, to jump back in my truck and floor it, but I couldn't move. It was like my feet were glued to the asphalt. The light was so bright now that I had to squint, but I couldn't look away. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not a solid object, but a swirling mass of colors that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. And then, just as I thought my eyes would burn out of my skull, everything went dark. Not just dark, but a complete absence of light that felt suffocating. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't even feel the ground beneath my feet. It was like I'd been erased from existence. I don't know how long I was in that void. It could have been seconds, hours, or days. Time had lost all meaning. The next thing I remember is a feeling of pressure, like I was being squeezed from all sides. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intensely uncomfortable. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move my arms, my legs, anything, but it was like I was paralyzed. And then, suddenly, I felt like I was falling. Not down, but in every direction at once. My stomach lurched, and I was sure I was going to be sick. But just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I found myself back on solid ground, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. My eyes flew open, and I was momentarily blinded by the harsh glare of my truck's headlights. I was lying on the road, the rough asphalt, digging into my back. For a moment I just lay there trying to process what had happened. Had I passed out? Had I dreamed the whole thing? But as my eyes adjusted and I looked around, I knew something was very, very wrong. The landscape around me was different. I was still on a road in the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't the same place I'd stopped. The mountains in the distance were shaped differently, and there were cacti and rock formations I didn't recognize. My truck was there, idling quietly, but it was facing the opposite direction from how I'd parked it. And the sky? The sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but that was impossible. It had been just after midnight when I'd seen the light. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaky and weak, and stumbled to the cab of my truck. I practically fell into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I checked the time on the dashboard clock. 5:47 a.m. I stared at those glowing numbers, trying to make sense of them. I'd lost almost 6 hours. 6 hours that I couldn't account for. My mind was reeling, trying to come up with some rational explanation. Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? But no. I remembered stopping the truck, getting out. I remembered that light. That incredible, impossible light. With a growing sense of dread, I turned to the tachograph. This device records a truck's speed and distance traveled, and it's tamper-proof. What I saw there made my blood run cold. According to the tachograph, my truck had traveled over 500 kilometers in those missing hours. But that was impossible. Even if I had somehow fallen asleep and kept driving, I couldn't have covered that distance in that time. And it didn't explain how my truck had turned around or why I'd woken up on the road. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely read the printout. I felt sick, dizzy, like the world was tilting on its axis. What the hell had happened to me? I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Those missing hours, the impossible distance, the strange lights in the sky. I didn't want to say the word, even in my own mind, but it kept creeping in. Abduction. I'd always scoffed at those stories, thought they were the ravings of attention seekers or the deeply disturbed. But now, sitting in my truck in the growing light of dawn, I wasn't so sure anymore. As the reality of my situation began to sink in, I noticed something else that sent a chill down my spine. My body felt different. Not painful, but off in a way I couldn't quite explain. My joints felt loose, like they'd been taken apart and put back together. There was a tingling sensation all over my skin, almost like pins and needles, but more intense. And when I looked at my hands, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. There were these tiny, perfectly circular marks on my fingertips, barely visible but definitely there. They looked almost like puncture wounds, but they didn't hurt when I touched them. I frantically checked the rest of my body, rolling up my sleeves and pant legs. The marks were everywhere, on my arms, my legs, even on my chest when I lifted my shirt. What the hell had been done to me? I felt violated, scared, and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I wanted to call someone, to tell them what had happened, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I was the one who'd experienced it. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at those marks on my skin and trying to piece together what had happened. Eventually I realized I needed to get moving. I had a delivery to make, and I was already hours late. But the thought of continuing my route like nothing had happened seemed absurd. How could I just go back to normal after whatever this was? With shaky hands, I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed menacing. Every glint of light in my mirrors made me flinch. I kept expecting to see that impossible light again, to feel that strange vibration. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out before me and the vast, indifferent desert all around. I tried to focus on driving, on the familiar routine of checking my mirrors and watching the road. But my mind kept wandering back to those missing hours. What had happened during that time? Had I really been taken by something? The word aliens floated through my mind, but I pushed it away. It was too much, too crazy to consider. But then what else could explain it? As I drove, I started noticing other strange things. My vision seemed sharper somehow, like everything was in high definition. I could see details on distant rock formations that I shouldn't have been able to make out. And the colors, they seemed more vivid, more intense than I remembered. It was like someone had turned up the saturation on the world. But the weirdest thing was the feeling in my head. It's hard to describe, but it was like there was a pressure there, a kind of buzzing energy that I'd never experienced before. Sometimes I'd catch myself zoning out, staring at nothing while my mind filled with strange images, flashes of light, curved metallic surfaces, things that looked like symbols or writing but like nothing I'd ever seen before. Were these memories trying to surface? Or was my mind just playing tricks on me, trying to fill in the blanks of those missing hours? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was driving me crazy. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like at any moment I might wake up and find out this was all some vivid, terrible dream. But the road under my wheels was real, the sun climbing higher in the sky was real, and those marks on my skin, those were definitely real. As the day wore on, the physical effects of my experience became more pronounced. I started feeling nauseous, my stomach churning like I was on a boat in rough seas. My head was pounding, not just a normal headache, but a deep, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. And then there was the fatigue, a bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel like I was wading through molasses. I had to pull over several times to be sick on the side of the road, my body rejecting food and water. It was like the worst flu I'd ever had, combined with the mother of all hangovers. But I knew this wasn't any normal illness. This was something else. Something connected to those missing hours and that impossible light in the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that my body was reacting to something it had been exposed to, something alien and fundamentally wrong. As I continued my journey, fighting through the pain and disorientation, I started noticing other odd occurrences. My watch had stopped working, the hands frozen at 12:17. Roughly the time I remembered seeing the light. My cell phone was acting up too, turning on and off randomly and showing strange symbols on the screen instead of numbers or letters. At one point, I swear I saw it levitate a few inches off the dashboard before dropping back down. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress and lack of sleep were making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever had happened to me out there in the desert had changed things, changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I found myself avoiding other people, afraid of what they might see in me. When I had to stop for gas, I kept my interactions brief and avoided eye contact. I couldn't shake the paranoid feeling that someone would look at me and just know that they'd see the alienness in me and recoil in horror. The strangest and most terrifying moment came as I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway. I glanced in my rearview mirror and for a split second I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. It was me, but not me. My features seemed slightly off, my eyes a shade lighter than they should have been. And there was something else, something in the expression that was decidedly inhuman. It was gone in an instant, replaced by my normal, haggard-looking face, but the image burned itself into my brain. What had they done to me? Had they changed me somehow, altered me on a fundamental level? I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to pull over and curl up in a ball on the side of the road. I wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against whatever forces had turned my life upside down. But I didn't. I just kept driving because what else could I do? I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, a reality that no longer made sense. And the worst part was, I had no idea if it was ever going to end. As I neared my destination, the physical symptoms began to subside, but they were replaced by something arguably worse, a growing sense of detachment from the world around me. It was like I was watching everything through a screen, or like I was a puppet going through the motions of my life. I completed my delivery on autopilot, barely registering the confused and concerned looks from the warehouse staff when I arrived hours late and looking like death warmed over. I couldn't bring myself to care about their questions or the reprimands I was sure to face from my boss. None of it seemed to matter anymore. How could I explain to them that the world as I knew it had fundamentally changed? That I was no longer sure of my place in it, or even who or what I really was? I found myself staring at my hands, half expecting them to start morphing into something alien at any moment. The tiny circular marks were still there, a constant reminder that what had happened to me was real, no matter how much I wished it wasn't. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to go back to my normal life, but it was like trying to fit into clothes that no longer fit. Everything felt wrong, off kilter. I couldn't sleep for more than an hour or two at a time without being jolted awake by vivid, terrifying nightmares of bright lights and cold metal tables. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced that they were coming back for me. Sometimes, in the moments between sleep and waking, I'd see shadowy figures at the foot of my bed, or hear whispers in a language I couldn't understand. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied, like some kind of lab rat. I started noticing other things too. Electronic devices would malfunction around me, lights would flicker when I entered a room. Once, during a particularly stressful moment, I swear I saw a glass of water move across the table without anyone touching it. I was terrified of what was happening to me, of what I might be becoming. It's been years since that night in Nuevo Leon, and I still don't have any real answers. I've tried to research what happened to me, spent countless hours on online forums and in support groups for people who claim to have had similar experiences. Some of their stories resonate with mine. Others seem so far-fetched that even I have trouble believing them. But who am I to judge? If you had told me before that night that I'd be abducted by aliens, I would have laughed in your face. Now, I'm not sure of anything anymore. I still drive trucks, but I avoid long, solitary routes when I can. I can't stand being alone in the desert at night, can't bear to look up at the stars without feeling a deep, primal fear. Sometimes I wonder if they'll come back for me, if one day I'll see that light again and disappear for good this time. Other times, I wonder if I'm already gone, if the person who came back that night isn't really me at all. All I know for sure is that something happened to me out there in the desert, something that defies explanation. And whatever it was, it changed me forever. I'm sharing this story not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened. Because if I disappear again, I want there to be a record, a testament to the fact that I was here, that I existed, and that for one terrifying night, I touched something beyond our world. Or it touched me. Third story, The Vanishing Hours on Route 40, Argentina, 2013. It was just another night on Route 40, or at least that's what I thought when I first got behind the wheel of my trusty old rig. The endless stretches of Argentinian highway had become as familiar to me as the lines on my own weathered hands after years of long-haul trucking. The darkness out here in the middle of nowhere was always thick, like a heavy blanket draped over the world. But that night it felt different somehow. More oppressive, more alive. I remember checking my watch as I pulled out onto the road, 11:43 p.m. The radio was playing some old tango, the kind my father used to love, and I hummed along absent-mindedly as the miles began to roll by. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the inky blackness of the Patagonian night. I'd driven this route 100 times before, could probably do it with my eyes closed if I had to. But something about that night set my nerves on edge from the very beginning. Maybe it was the unusual stillness in the air, or the way the stars seemed to shine just a little too brightly overhead. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I'd been driving for about an hour when I first noticed the light. At first I thought nothing of it. Probably just another truck coming up behind me, I figured. But as I watched it in my rearview mirror, something about its movement struck me as off. It seemed to be pulsing, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that was decidedly unnatural. And it was moving fast. Too fast. Before I knew it, the light was no longer behind me but beside me, keeping pace with my truck effortlessly despite the fact that I was pushing 70 miles per hour. My heart began to race as I realized that whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't another vehicle. The light was intensely bright, almost painful to look at directly, and it cast long, alien shadows across the cab of my truck. I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead, my palms growing slick against the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to floor it, to try and outrun whatever the hell this thing was. But another part, a primal, instinctive part, told me that would be pointless. So instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I eased my foot off the gas and began to slow down, pulling over to the side of the deserted highway. As soon as my truck came to a stop, everything changed. The light, which had been keeping pace with me moments before, suddenly enveloped my entire vehicle. It was so bright that I had to squeeze my eyes shut, but even then I could see it burning through my eyelids, turning the world a searing, unnatural white. And then came the paralysis. It started in my fingertips, a tingling numbness that rapidly spread up my arms, across my chest, and down to my toes. In a matter of seconds, I found myself completely immobilized, unable to so much as twitch a muscle or call out for help. The panic that washed over me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. I was trapped, helpless, at the mercy of whatever this was. And then came the pressure. It felt as if some enormous, invisible hand was pressing down on me from all sides, squeezing the air from my lungs and making it nearly impossible to breathe. My ears popped painfully as if I was rapidly changing altitude, and I became acutely aware of a low, thrumming vibration that seemed to penetrate, Every cell of my body, time lost all meaning in those moments. I don't know if it lasted for seconds or hours, but I do know that I've never felt more terrified or more alone than I did then, frozen in place as that otherworldly light consumed everything around me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I was sure my body would simply give out under the immense pressure, everything stopped. The light vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, plunging me back into the familiar darkness of the Patagonian night. The paralysis lifted, and I found myself gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably as they gripped the steering wheel. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My mind reeled, unable to make sense of the experience. Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? Had it all been some kind of vivid hallucination? But no. The lingering ache in my muscles and the pounding of my heart told me that whatever I'd just been through had been all too real. With trembling fingers, I fumbled for the interior light switch, flooding the cab with a weak yellow glow. That seemed pathetically inadequate after the otherworldly brilliance I'd just witnessed. My eyes fell on the clock on the dashboard, and I felt my blood run cold. 1:37 a.m. Nearly 2 hours had passed since I'd first spotted that strange light, but it felt like only minutes had gone by. I scrambled for my logbook, hoping against hope that I'd simply lost track of time. But the tachograph confirmed the impossible. There was a gap in my journey, a period of almost 2 hours that I couldn't account for. Panic gripped me anew as I realized the full implications of what had happened. 2 hours of my life just gone. Vanished into thin air along with that bizarre light. I ran my hands over my body, half expecting to find some kind of mark or evidence of what I'd endured. But there was nothing. No physical trace of the ordeal I'd just been through. And yet, I could feel that something had changed. There was a heaviness in my limbs, a strange tingling sensation that lingered in my fingertips and toes. My head throbbed with a dull ache, and my vision seemed slightly off, as if the world around me had shifted ever so slightly out of focus. With shaking hands, I reached for my thermos of coffee, desperate for something familiar and grounding. As I took a sip, I noticed for the first time that the liquid inside was ice cold. It had been steaming hot when I'd poured it at the start of my journey, and even accounting for the passage of time, it shouldn't have cooled so completely. This small detail, so mundane and yet so wrong, sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through me. What else had changed? What else had been done to me during those lost hours? I knew I should get moving, that I needed to complete my delivery and report what had happened. But the thought of driving on, of continuing down this lonely stretch of highway, where I'd just experienced something so utterly beyond my comprehension, filled me with dread. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to piece together some kind of explanation for what I'd been through. Aliens. It seemed absurd, the stuff of cheesy sci-fi movies, and yet what else could explain the impossible light, the lost time, the physical sensations I'd experienced? I'd never been one for conspiracy theories or tales of the paranormal, but sitting there in the dark, with the weight of those missing hours pressing down on me, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. Eventually, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and I knew I couldn't put off the inevitable any longer. With a deep breath, I turned the key in the ignition, the familiar rumble of the engine providing a small measure of comfort. As I pulled back onto Route 40, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving something behind. Some part of myself that had been irrevocably changed by whatever had happened during those lost hours. The road ahead seemed different now, full of shadows and potential threats that I'd never noticed before. And as I drove on into the uncertain future, I knew that my life would never be the same again. The rest of that drive was a blur of anxiety and hypervigilance. Every flicker of light in my peripheral vision, every odd shadow cast by the rising sun, sent my heart racing. I kept expecting that blinding light to reappear, to engulf me once more in its otherworldly glow. My hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel that my knuckles had turned white, and I found myself obsessively checking the clock, terrified of losing more time. When I finally reached my destination, a small trucking depot on the outskirts of a nondescript town, I was a wreck. My colleagues immediately noticed something was off. I must have looked like hell, pale, shaking, with dark circles under my eyes that spoke of more than just a long night on the road. But how could I explain what had happened? The words stuck in my throat as I tried to articulate the experience. In the harsh light of day, surrounded by the mundane sights and sounds of the depot, it all seemed so impossible, so absurd. I mumbled something about not feeling well, about having a rough night, and retreated to the break room where I collapsed into a chair, my mind still reeling. As the day wore on, I found myself grappling with a deep-seated fear that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the terror of what had happened, but the gnawing dread of what it might mean. Had I really been abducted by something? And if so, what had they done to me during those missing hours? I couldn't stop examining my body, looking for any sign of interference or alteration. Every ache, every odd sensation became a potential clue. At one point, I caught sight of myself in the grimy mirror of the depot bathroom and was struck by how different I looked. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on exactly, but there was something in my eyes, a haunted quality that hadn't been there before. I tried to go about my usual routine, to lose myself in the familiar tasks of unloading and paperwork, but everything felt off-kilter. The world around me seemed slightly out of sync, as if I was viewing it through a distorted lens. Conversations with my co-workers felt stilted and strange, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now fundamentally different from them in some profound, inexplicable way. That night, as I lay in my bunk in the back of my truck, sleep eluded me completely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blinding light, felt the crushing pressure and paralyzing terror all over again. The silence of the night was oppressive, broken only by the occasional passing vehicle on the nearby highway. Each distant engine sound made me tense up, half expecting it to transform into the unearthly hum of whatever had taken me. I found myself obsessively replaying the events of the previous night, searching for some detail I might have missed, some rational explanation that could make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. Why me? Why that particular stretch of road? And most disturbingly, what if it happened again? The thought of returning to Route 40, of driving through the night alone, filled me with a level of fear I'd never experienced before. I'd always loved the solitude of long-haul trucking, the freedom of the open road. But now that once comforting solitude felt like a vulnerability, leaving me exposed and defenseless against forces I couldn't begin to understand. As the days passed, I found myself caught in a strange limbo between desperately wanting answers and being terrified of what those answers might be. I scoured the internet for similar experiences, spending countless hours reading through forums and conspiracy theory websites. Some of the stories I found chilled me to the bone, eerily similar to what I'd been through. Others seemed so outlandish that they should have been comforting in their absurdity, but instead, they only fueled my growing paranoia. I became obsessed with the idea of missing time, constantly checking and double-checking my watch against other clocks, terrified of losing even a minute. Sleep, when it came at all, was filled with vivid, terrifying dreams of being back in that moment of paralysis, helpless and alone in the face of something utterly alien. I'd wake up gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat, the phantom sensation of that crushing pressure still lingering on my skin. The impact on my work was immediate and severe. I couldn't bring myself to take any night routes. The mere thought of being out on those dark, lonely roads after sunset sending me into a panic. My boss was understanding at first, assuming I was going through some personal issues. But as the weeks dragged on and I continued to refuse night drives, his patience began to wear thin. I knew I was jeopardizing my job, my livelihood, but the fear was too overwhelming. Even daylight drives became an exercise in constant vigilance, my eyes darting to the sky at the slightest hint of an unusual light or shadow. I found myself mapping out routes that avoided isolated areas, sticking to busier highways, even if it meant longer trips. The camaraderie I'd once enjoyed with other truckers at rest stops and diners faded away as I became more withdrawn, unable to engage in casual conversation without the weight of my experience pressing down on me. How could I chat about weather and road conditions when my entire world had been turned upside down? About a month after the incident, I experienced something that shook me to my core. I was at home, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV, when suddenly the lights in my apartment began to flicker. A low, humming vibration filled the air, eerily similar to what I'd felt that night on Route 40. Panic gripped me instantly. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over my coffee table. In my haste to get to the window, outside the streetlights were pulsing in an unnatural rhythm, and for a heart-stopping moment, I saw a bright light hovering just above the rooftops of the neighboring buildings. I stood there, frozen in terror, certain that they had come back for me. But then, as quickly as it had started, everything returned to normal. The light stabilized, the humming ceased, and the strange light in the sky vanished. I later found out it had been a brief power surge caused by some work on the local electrical grid, but the experience left me shaken to my core. It was a stark reminder that no matter where I went, no matter how I tried to hide or protect myself, the memory and the fear of what had happened would always be with me. As weeks turned into months, I found myself spiraling deeper into a pit of paranoia and isolation. The once comforting routines of my life now felt like a thin veneer, barely concealing the terrifying reality I'd glimpsed that night on Route 40. I became hyper-aware of every unusual light in the sky, every unexplained sound in the night. Even the most mundane occurrences took on sinister overtones in my mind. A car's headlights reflecting off a window would send my heart racing, convinced it was the return of that otherworldly glow. The hum of my refrigerator in the quiet of night would sometimes mimic that strange vibration I'd felt, jolting me awake in a cold sweat. I found myself avoiding social interactions, unable to relate to people who hadn't experienced what I had. How could I explain the constant fear, the feeling of being watched, the sense that reality itself had somehow shifted? My family and the few friends I had left began to worry, suggesting therapy or medication. But how could I possibly explain to a therapist what had happened without sounding completely insane? The isolation only deepened my fears, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the constant replaying of that night in my mind. About 6 months after the incident, I hit rock bottom. I'd lost my job, unable to perform the long-haul duties that had once been second nature to me. My savings were dwindling, and I spent most of my days holed up in my apartment, blinds drawn, obsessively monitoring conspiracy websites and UFO forums. It was during one of these late-night internet binges that I came across a post that caught my eye. Someone claiming to be a former government operative was discussing a series of classified incidents along Route 40 in Argentina. As I read through the details, my blood ran cold. The poster described phenomena eerily similar to what I'd experienced. Strange lights, missing time, inexplicable physical sensations. But what truly shook me was the mention of a specific date, the very night of my encounter. According to this anonymous source, there had been a flurry of unusual activity reported in the area that night, not just by civilians, but by military personnel as well. The post went on to suggest that the government had been monitoring the region for years, aware of some kind of interdimensional portal or extraterrestrial hotspot. I must have read that post 100 times, my mind reeling with the implications. Was this proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd experienced was real? Or was I simply falling deeper into a rabbit hole of delusion and conspiracy theories? That night, for the first time since the incident, I made a decision. I couldn't go on living like this, consumed by fear and trapped in a prison of my own making. I had to go back to Route 40, back to the spot where it all happened. Maybe, there, in the place where my world had been turned upside down, I could find some answers, or at least some closure. The very thought of returning filled me with dread, but also with a strange sense of purpose. I spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, poring over maps, and steeling myself for what lay ahead. As I set out on that fateful journey, retracing the route I'd taken months before, I felt a mix of terror and determination. The familiar landscape of Route 40 stretched out before me, both comforting in its familiarity and terrifying in its potential. As night fell and the stars came out, eerily bright in the clear Patagonian sky, I found myself holding my breath, half expecting that light to appear at any moment. But as the hours ticked by and nothing happened, I began to feel disappointed. It was a strange emotion, one I couldn't quite reconcile. Part of me was relieved to be making this journey without incident, but another part, a part I was almost ashamed to acknowledge, yearned for some sign, some confirmation that what I'd experienced was real. As dawn broke and I realized I'd driven through the night without any supernatural occurrence, I was left with a profound sense of emptiness. No answers, no closure, just the vast, indifferent expanse of the Patagonian wilderness. I pulled over at a rest stop, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains, and found myself grappling with a troubling question. Which was worse, the terror of that inexplicable encounter, or the gnawing uncertainty of never knowing the truth? As I sat there, caught between fear of the unknown and the maddening desire for answers, I realized that my journey, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over. Whatever had happened that night on Route 40, whatever forces were at work in this vast, mysterious universe, I knew that I would spend the rest of my life searching for understanding, forever changed by a brief encounter on a lonely stretch of highway in the heart of Patagonia.